The sanctions were supposed to slow China down. That was the premise. Restrict the chips, blacklist the firms, choke the supply chain, pressure allies, tighten export controls, and eventually Beijing runs into a wall it can't engineer its way around. In October 2022, the Biden administration expanded restrictions targeting advanced semiconductors and AI hardware. By 2025, more than 47 major Chinese entities connected to chips, AI, aerospace, quantum computing, and military-linked research had landed on various American restriction lists in one form or another. China's response was not subtle. It filed roughly 2 million patent applications in a single year. Pause on that number for a second. 2 million. That is more patent activity than the United States, Japan, South Korea, and most of Europe combined. Some of those patents are weak, some are strategic spam. Critics point that out immediately, and honestly, they aren't entirely wrong. But that's also the easy interpretation, the comforting one. Because buried inside that flood is something much more important. China stopped behaving like a country trying to catch up. It started behaving like a country building redundancy against technological isolation. And that changes the conversation completely. Most people still imagine sanctions as economic punishment, as pressure. But the modern version is really about time. Washington wasn't trying to destroy China's tech sector overnight. The goal was to delay it. 5 years if possible, 10 if lucky. Long enough for the US and its allies to consolidate advantages in AI infrastructure, lithography, aerospace systems, quantum computing, advanced materials. The industries likely to define military and economic power over the next several decades. The problem is that delay cuts both ways. Pressure can suffocate an industrial system. It can also force one to evolve faster. There's a detail from 2023 that almost nobody outside semiconductor circles paid attention to. While American officials were warning that export controls would cripple Chinese advanced chip development, China's domestic semiconductor equipment sector quietly increased investment at a pace that looked almost irrational. Naura Technology, Advanced Microfabrication Equipment China, AMEC, and dozens of second-tier suppliers suddenly received financing, procurement guarantees, and provincial support from local governments terrified of dependency. It looked messy because it was messy. Industrial policy usually is. The United States spent decades optimizing global efficiency. China, under sanctions, started optimizing survivability instead. Those are very different systems. Efficient systems break elegantly. Survivable systems absorb pain and keep moving. And this isn't limited to chips. Electric vehicles, industrial robotics, battery chemistry, photovoltaics, telecommunications hardware, commercial drones. China has been building parallel supply chains across all of them at the same time. The Ministry of Industry and Information Technology wasn't just funding companies. It was mapping bottlenecks, rare earth refining, precision machine tools, industrial software, optical components, things most consumers will never think about until they disappear. That's the uncomfortable part for Washington. Not that China became self-sufficient overnight. It didn't. The country still depends heavily on foreign lithography, high-end EDA software, and certain precision manufacturing tools. TSMC still matters enormously. ASML still matters enormously. NVIDIA definitely matters. But dependence and paralysis are not the same thing. SMIC's progress on its 7-nanometer class process shocked people precisely because it wasn't supposed to happen that quickly under export restrictions. The yields reportedly weren't great. The costs were high. Analysts argued the node wasn't commercially scalable. Fair criticisms. Yet the important fact remained, they did it anyway, which creates a bigger question sitting underneath this entire story. What happens when the world's second-largest economy concludes it can no longer trust access to the global technology system itself? Because once a country reaches that conclusion, efficiency stops being the priority. Independence becomes the priority. And independence is expensive, duplicative, sometimes wasteful, but also incredibly hard to stop once momentum builds. There's a strange irony here. For years, American policymakers accused China of relying too heavily on Western technology. Then Washington applied enough pressure that Beijing accelerated the exact domestic innovation drive American strategists feared most. Diplomacy occasionally resembles hitting your own foot with a hammer and calling it leverage. Now, to be fair, the American argument still has real weight behind it. Cutting-edge semiconductor manufacturing remains brutally difficult. EUV lithography isn't something you improvise in a warehouse outside Shenzhen. The gap at the frontier still exists. And when US officials say China faces enormous barriers in advanced AI compute, they are correct. But here's where the story gets more complicated than the headlines. China may not need to fully catch the frontier to change the balance of power. It may only need to become good enough at scale. Good enough chips, good enough AI models, good enough industrial automation, good enough aerospace systems produced cheaply, domestically, and in huge numbers. History has examples of this. The Soviet Union lost the computing race despite immense scientific talent because its innovation ecosystem became rigid and isolated. Japan dominated consumer electronics for years but struggled in software transitions. Technological leadership is never permanent. It moves, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And patent filings alone don't prove victory. That's important. Quantity is not quality. 1,000,000 bad patents are still bad patents. But they do reveal intent. They reveal where engineers are being hired, where capital is moving, which sectors governments consider existential, and what a country believes it may soon be denied access to. Remember that number from the opening, 2 million. Later, we're going to look at what those patents are actually targeting. Because once you separate the noise from the strategic filings, a very different picture starts to emerge. A lot of China's patent surge looks ridiculous if you stare at it the wrong way. There are patents for minor manufacturing tweaks, interface adjustments, battery pack layouts that differ by millimeters, algorithms that sound suspiciously like older algorithms with fresh paperwork attached. Western analysts love pointing this out because, frankly, some of it deserves ridicule. China spent years rewarding patent quantity through local subsidies, university metrics, and bureaucratic incentives. File more patents, receive more funding. Predictably, people filed more patents. But something changed after around 2019. The center of gravity moved from consumer tech imitation toward industrial choke points. That distinction matters more than people realize, because the real competition between the United States and China isn't about who builds the next smartphone people brag about online. It's about who controls the invisible infrastructure underneath modern civilization: power electronics, grid-scale batteries, machine vision systems, industrial sensors, gallium refining, advanced bearings, semiconductor packaging, things most viewers never think about because when they work properly, they're invisible. Take semiconductor packaging, for example. Not the glamorous part of chips. Nobody outside engineering conferences gets excited about packaging technology. But advanced packaging became one of Beijing's workaround strategies after export controls tightened around cutting-edge fabrication. If you can't immediately dominate the most advanced nodes, you improve performance another way. Stack chips vertically, optimize interconnects, redesign thermal management, squeeze more capability from mature processes. It's less cinematic than inventing a magical breakthrough chip. It's also how real industrial systems adapt. Huawei's Mate 60 Pro caused panic in Washington not because it proved China had suddenly mastered the entire semiconductor stack. It didn't. The concern was subtler. The phone demonstrated that Chinese firms could still produce strategically meaningful advances under pressure. Imperfect advances, expensive advances, but functioning ones. And that's enough to keep American planners awake at night. Because sanctions work best when the targeted country remains dependent psychologically, not just technologically. Iran still wants access to Western finance. Russia still wants Western machinery. The system retains gravity. China is different. Beijing increasingly behaves like it assumes permanent technological containment is inevitable. Once policymakers reach that conclusion, the objective changes from reintegration to endurance. You can see this mentality everywhere now. In 2024, China established another massive state-backed semiconductor investment vehicle, what analysts casually call the Big Fund 3, roughly $47 billion. That's larger than the GDP of some countries being directed into one industrial ecosystem. Meanwhile, provincial governments started competing with each other to attract chip suppliers, the same way cities once fought over factories or ports. Some of those investments will fail spectacularly. A few already have. Tsinghua Unigroup collapsed under debt pressure after years of aggressive expansion. Wuhan Hongxin Semiconductor became infamous for promising advanced fabrication capabilities it never delivered. Half-built facilities sat empty while local officials quietly stopped answering questions. Industrial bubbles create fraud. They always do. America had Theranos. China has ghost fabs. Human nature scales internationally. Still, focusing only on the failures misses the more important pattern. Beijing appears willing to tolerate enormous inefficiency if it increases strategic autonomy over time. That is not how private markets usually think. It is how states behave when they believe vulnerability itself is dangerous. And honestly, from China's perspective, the logic isn't irrational. Imagine watching the United States freeze Russian foreign reserves after the Ukraine invasion. Imagine watching Washington pressure allies to restrict chip exports, software licenses, lithography systems, and AI accelerators. Whether you agree with American policy or not, the message to Beijing was unmistakable. Dependency can become leverage overnight. Countries learn from observing other countries get punished. Quietly. There's another layer here most coverage skips entirely. Patents are not just about invention. They're also defensive territory markers. Filing huge volumes of intellectual property claims allows Chinese firms to negotiate, cross-license, litigate, block competitors, or simply flood strategic sectors with legal ambiguity. It's industrial trench warfare disguised as paperwork. Meanwhile, the United States still holds enormous advantages that deserve acknowledgement. American universities remain magnets for elite global research talent. NVIDIA dominates AI accelerators. ASML, aligned closely with the West, still controls EUV lithography. The dollar remains deeply embedded in global finance. China hasn't overturned any of that. Yet the gap between not dominant and not dangerous is enormous. That's where I think some Western commentary becomes strangely complacent. There's an assumption that because China hasn't fully matched frontier capability, the broader strategy must therefore be succeeding. But global power doesn't require perfection. It requires resilience, manufacturing scale, and enough technical competence to avoid coercion. Those are different thresholds. Look at electric vehicles. 10 years ago, many Western executives still treated Chinese EV companies like low-end imitators. BYD is now exporting aggressively across Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia, even parts of the Middle East. CATL became central to global battery supply chains so quickly that many governments barely processed what happened until dependency already existed. And here's the part I keep coming back to. The sanctions era may ultimately produce two parallel technology ecosystems instead of one dominant global system. Separate standards, separate chip stacks, separate software environments, separate supply chains optimized around geopolitical trust rather than efficiency. That would be slower, more expensive, less elegant, but probably more stable from the perspective of governments that no longer trust interdependence. There's a historical echo here people rarely mention. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union tried to build an insulated technological ecosystem, largely isolated from Western supply chains. It failed for many reasons: rigid bureaucracy, weak incentives, lack of consumer dynamism. China is studying that failure carefully. Beijing's model isn't Soviet isolation. It's selective integration combined with domestic substitution wherever strategic vulnerability appears. Very different approach. And the patent filings start making more sense once you see them through that lens. The point isn't simply innovation metrics. The point is preparing for a world where access can disappear, which leads to the real complication in this story. Because the more Washington restricts technology transfers, the more China's internal political argument shifts in favor of self-reliance hardliners who already believed dependence on the West was a strategic mistake from the beginning. There's a phrase Xi Jinping has repeated for years now: self-reliance in science and technology. At first, many Western observers treated it like standard political language. Every government talks about innovation. Every leader promises technological independence. Politicians inhale these words like oxygen. But after the Trump tariffs, the Huawei sanctions, the semiconductor restrictions, and the widening export control regime under Biden, that phrase stopped sounding rhetorical inside China. It became operational doctrine. And this is where the story reverses in a way I don't think Washington fully anticipated. Because sanctions don't land in a political vacuum. They land inside existing ideological debates, inside bureaucratic rivalries, inside national memories. China already had factions arguing that dependence on American technology was fundamentally dangerous long before the export controls escalated. The sanctions didn't create that worldview. They validated it. Imagine being a Chinese policymaker who spent 15 years warning that relying on foreign chip architectures, foreign operating systems, foreign lithography equipment, and foreign cloud infrastructure carried long-term strategic risk. Then the United States begins systematically restricting all of them. From Beijing's perspective, that looks less like random hostility and more like confirmation. That matters because once an internal debate is won, state capacity moves differently. Funding accelerates. Universities adjust priorities. Procurement changes. Local governments compete to align with national strategy. Entire industrial ecosystems reorganize around a political objective. In China's case, that objective increasingly became technological redundancy at almost any cost. And redundancy is expensive. Very expensive. China's semiconductor industry reportedly attracted hundreds of billions of dollars in state-linked financing over the last decade through central funds, provincial programs, tax incentives, and state bank lending. Some estimates place the broader strategic technology push far higher if you include AI, telecom infrastructure, EV supply chains, aerospace, quantum research, and industrial automation. No market economy would allocate capital this way voluntarily. That's exactly the point. The logic is geopolitical, not financial. There's a small example that explains this better than any abstract theory. In 2024, several Chinese firms began aggressively developing domestic replacements for foreign industrial software tools. The invisible engineering platforms used to design factories, simulate manufacturing systems, and manage supply chains. Most viewers have never heard of these products. Yet losing access to them during a geopolitical crisis could paralyze entire sectors. This is how Beijing now thinks. Not what is profitable, but what could become leverage against us later. Different mindset entirely. The irony is almost painful. For decades, American strategists wanted China integrated into a global system shaped largely by Western rules, Western finance, Western standards, and Western technology. Interdependence was supposed to moderate geopolitical rivalry, because both sides benefited too much from the system to seriously fracture it. Instead, both powers are gradually building contingency plans for separation. Not complete separation. That would be economically catastrophic for everyone involved. The US and Chinese economies remain deeply intertwined through trade, manufacturing, finance, and consumer markets. Apple still relies heavily on Chinese production capacity. China still relies heavily on foreign demand and external technology inputs. But psychologically, something changed after 2022. The assumption of permanence disappeared. And once countries stop believing systems are permanent, they start preparing for rupture even if rupture never arrives. You can already see the consequences spreading beyond China itself. India is expanding semiconductor ambitions. Vietnam is absorbing manufacturing shifts. Saudi Arabia is investing heavily in AI infrastructure. Europe suddenly talks about strategic autonomy every other week, despite depending heavily on both American defense and Chinese manufacturing. Everyone is hedging now. That's usually what happens before the global order becomes more fragmented. Still, I think it's important not to drift into lazy, China is winning narratives, because reality is more uneven than that. China's demographic problems are real. Debt levels are dangerous. Youth unemployment became politically sensitive enough that authorities temporarily stopped publishing some data categories. Advanced semiconductor bottlenecks remain serious. Many Chinese firms still depend heavily on Western intellectual property at critical layers. This is not a clean victory story for either side. It's a stress test. And stress tests reveal things normal conditions hide. The United States discovered it could weaponize supply chain dominance more aggressively than many countries expected. China discovered it could absorb more technological pressure than many Americans expected. Both sides learned something uncomfortable about the other. But here's the deeper issue underneath all this. The more sanctions expand, the more innovation itself starts dividing into geopolitical blocks. Researchers collaborate less freely. Supply chains regionalize. Scientific openness shrinks. The world becomes technologically bilingual, maybe even technologically tribal. That might sound abstract today, until your phone, your car, your AI tools, your cloud systems, and eventually your economy depend on which side's standards your country chose 5 years earlier. Remember that number from the beginning. 2 million patent filings. By itself, the number proves almost nothing. Countries can inflate statistics. Bureaucracies can manufacture incentives. Entire industries can learn how to game reporting systems. China has absolutely done some of that. But numbers at this scale still reveal direction, and the direction is unmistakable. Beijing is preparing for a world where access to critical technology can no longer be assumed, not temporarily interrupted, permanently uncertain. That's the core shift underneath everything we've talked about. The patents, the chip funds, the domestic software push, the battery supply chains. the industrial subsidies, they're all pieces of the same strategic conclusion. China believes the era of frictionless globalization is ending. Honestly, I think Washington believes that too. That's why this story matters far beyond semiconductors or trade policy. What we're watching isn't just a dispute between two governments. It's the slow construction of parallel systems by two powers that increasingly expect confrontation to outlast diplomacy. And parallel systems have consequences. Prices rise because efficiency falls. Countries get pressured to choose standards. Smaller economies lose flexibility. Scientific collaboration becomes political. Even corporations start behaving differently. 10 years ago, multinational firms optimized for cost. Today, they optimize for resilience, redundancy, and geopolitical survival. Very different world. There's also a question I don't think either side fully answers yet. What happens if both strategies partially succeed at the same time? Imagine an America that successfully preserves leadership at the technological frontier. The most advanced AI chips, aerospace systems, quantum research, next-generation computing. That is completely plausible. Now imagine a China that becomes impossible to isolate because it controls mature manufacturing scale, industrial supply chains, battery production, rare earth processing, commercial drones, telecom infrastructure, and good enough AI deployed across huge markets. That is also plausible. Which means this may not end with one side winning in the clean Cold War language people keep reaching for. It may end with a divided technological landscape where both systems survive, both systems innovate, and both systems distrust each other deeply enough to keep decoupling in slow motion. Messier outcome. Probably the more realistic one, too. My own suspicion is that the sanctions campaign will eventually be viewed as both strategically rational and historically catalytic. Rational because the United States genuinely saw a narrowing window to protect key technologies. Catalytic because the pressure accelerated China's determination to industrialize entire sectors it once outsourced or neglected. Pressure slowed parts of China's rise. It also hardened it. And that may end up being the contradiction historians focus on years from now. 47 companies were banned. China answered with millions of patents, massive industrial mobilization, and a very clear message. If the door closes, they'll build another system outside it. Whether that system becomes genuinely equal to the West is still uncertain, but it no longer looks temporary. If you enjoyed this one, stick around. The next decade is going to produce some very strange economic maps.